All right, can y'all hear me okay? I know it's a small room, but the microphones help me not lose my voice. So I appreciate you providing that. And as Ashley said, she's been in enough trainings with me to know that I don't like to stand still. So she gave me a lapel mic, which was very nice. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to start talking about SPGEs, which are special purpose governmental entities, and I will explain what that means. Boards and commissions to start out. So for our basic agenda, we're going to talk about the statutory authority for these boards, special purpose governmental entities, and the like. Some of them are formed by a city under home rule authority, or they're formed under statutory authority granted by the state. And when they're formed under the city, some of the boards, commissions, committees are formed by either the executive authority, through the city's executive authority to, usually to provide for the public health, safety, and welfare of the citizens, or through the legislative authority, which is generally to, those are more to conduct studies for legislative proposals. So things within the executive function of the city. Statutory boards, the authority to establish statutory boards, it's in statute. The statute will generally cover membership, operation, budget, appointment, removal, vacancies. It'll cover all those processes. So it's important when you're looking at establishing a board to determine, is it covered by state law? Because you may have strict membership requirements. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that works. So with authority, the statutes can dictate how you establish the boards. So are they established by ordinance? Are they established by the executive? Are they established by the legislative body? Generally, if it's a board that is anticipated by statute, it's going to be established by ordinance. Okay? If the statute is silent, then the city can choose how to establish it. But again, to provide public with adequate notice and to make sure that the board is anticipated for future work, the city's probably going to want to establish it by ordinance anyway. So if the city does choose to establish a board, commission, or committee by resolution, executive order, or municipal order, that's going to, the method of establishing it is going to depend on what authority you're acting under. So in a city manager form of government, the Board of Commissioners, y'all share executive and legislative authority, right? If you are establishing a board, again, under the executive authority, the enforcement arm, then you would do it by executive order. If it's legislative, so for example, establishing a committee to study future capital projects. Let's say that you wanted to do that. You wanted to get citizens' involvement. That would generally be under the legislative authority. But you cannot delegate away statutory authority to a committee unless it's specifically authorized by statute. So you might want to establish a personnel committee, let's just say, to look at potentials for recruitment and retention. So it would be that committee's responsibility to go out and look at ideas, try to look at best practices. However, you cannot delegate to that committee the authority to create a personnel manual or to amend the personnel manual or to amend city ordinances, because that's statutory authority that is reserved to the commission. Okay? So the number of members is probably going to be restricted by statute. So for example, Board of Adjustments may have 3, 5, or 7 members. They're always odd, so you never have a tie. But a lot of times they are. So board of, for example, the Code Enforcement Board. A Code Enforcement Board, you have to have a minimum number of 3 persons who can serve before you can create a Code Enforcement Board. So that sometimes there are minimums, maximums. They establish terms. Generally, it's going to be 4 years, and the statute will say it's staggered appointment. So when you create it, you'll have one person who is appointed for 1 year, a 1-year term, one person who's appointed for a 2-year term, one person who's appointed for a 3-year term, so on and so forth. But then once they serve that term, that position is then filled for a 4-year term, but that keeps the appointment staggered so you don't have a completely vacant board or commission. The statutes frequently will prohibit an elected or appointed official from serving on one of the boards or committees or commissions. Now, for example, Tourism and Convention Commission requires representation, specific representation from a hotel, restaurant, and business communities. The Code Enforcement Board, they prohibit having anyone serve on the Code Enforcement Board whose position of employment with the city is something the Code Enforcement Board has jurisdiction over. So housing, buildings, your code enforcement officer cannot also be on the Code Enforcement Board, that type of thing. Cities can generally establish any additional training requirements, education, background experience that they would like. I caution you from doing that in city ordinance for boards and commissions unless you know that you have a lot of people to serve on there. Because the majority of cities I know that have multiple boards, they're struggling to get people to serve anyway. Because most of the boards, even if they pay a fee, it's a nominal fee. So if you put too many restrictions on there and narrow your pool too far, you may find that you have difficulty filling your board or commission. And members can be unpaid, or you have the discretion whether to pay them. For example, local development authorities are unpaid pursuant to state law, but the city has the discretion of paying planning commission members. Another cautionary tale. If you pay a board or commission $250 per meeting, and they have the discretion to call a special called meeting, then what do you think happens? Yeah. Let's meet every month, right? So, that's just something to think about when you're crafting, if you feel that it's going to be necessary, or even you just want to, provide some measure of compensation to people serving on these boards, because it's a lot of work. It might be good to restrict the number of meetings for which they'd be paid to kind of avoid that problem. Not that I have any idea of any city that's happened to, of course. As Ashley's well aware, I always say hypothetically, like when clerks ask me questions, like hypothetically. Okay, the jurisdiction of the board, commissioner, committee can be outlined in statute, or the city may have some discretion. So, for example, code enforcement boards. Code enforcement boards can be given jurisdiction to hear appeals of the violation of any city ordinance, as long as it's a civil fine. But some code enforcement boards are limited strictly to nuisance codes, nuisance ordinances, the like, but it can be as expansive as hearing business license violations or whatever type of violation the city has. A quorum for taking action is a majority of the board members, usually specified by numbers, and this can change. You want to pay attention in state law. If there's a statute that governs an individual board, the necessary number of people to vote or that will be considered for a quorum, that can change. So I believe, for example, planning commissions, when they have to hear certain, it's not planning commissions, voting restrictions, that's what it is. Sometimes in statute, they require a majority plus one. So your quorum might be a majority, but you have to have a majority of the actual members of the board plus one to pass it. So it can get kind of tricky, and your city attorney needs to be involved in looking at the statutes. So most boards and commissions will receive an allocation from the city. But that's going to depend. It doesn't mean that they get to spend money. It generally means that they receive an allocation for operation, or it may just be in the general administrative budget. Independent boards and commissions are tasked with establishing a budget. So, for example, your tourism commission, they have to pass a budget or have a budget and submit it to the city for adoption. Boards and commissions that have taxing and fee setting authority, and I don't know if y'all have any. Some of them, for example, your tourism commission doesn't have independent taxing authority, but you may have like you may have an ambulance or an EMS commission or something like that that would actually be able to impose taxes. But I don't think y'all do, actually, no. Earl's saying no, so you don't, good. So appointments, vacancies, and removals, board members are usually appointed by the executive authority. Now, even in a city manager form of government, there are some statutes, and there aren't many, but they actually say that the mayor has to appoint. So even in a city manager form of government, the mayor would have to appoint and the legislative body would have to ratify. However, if it just says executive appointment, then the Board of Commissioners as a whole appoints. Okay? And legislative bodies are authorized to appoint a limited number of boards aside from the executive authority. So those are ambulance service districts are one of the few that I'm aware of. Okay? And do y'all have any joint boards or commissions with Boyle County, probably? So in those, they usually have a clear statutory requirement for how the boards and commissions are appointed. When you have joint, usually you have a certain number of board members that are appointed by the city, and they'll be appointed through the executive authority with ratification or assent of the legislative body as a whole. And vacancies are usually filled the same way appointments are. So everybody decides, you fill your vacancy. Removal authority, that's going to be the commissioner as a whole, again, because it's under the executive authority. And in some instances, members will be entitled to a written reason for their removal. So planning and zoning commission members, if you're going to remove one, they can only be removed for willful misconduct, neglect of duty, inefficiency, or incapacity. So they have to be provided with a reason for a written statement of removal, a right to appeal. And sometimes the removal authority is going to differ. So a library board of trustees, they're appointed by the mayor but removed by the legislative body. If you had a city library board of trustees, which I don't think you do. Now, in general, those are kind of the rules for appointment and removal. Like we said, it's usually going to be misconduct, incapacity, or willful neglect of duties, or inefficiency. And then special district members, they can be removed for inefficiency, neglect of duty, malfeasance, or conflict of interest. And conflict of interest, we hear that a lot. Conflict of interest is actually a term of art in Kentucky. So conflict of interest is going to mean that there is a direct financial conflict. Not just, somebody's wife is a real estate agent and they're voting on planning and zoning codes. That's not really a conflict of interest. It really means a direct financial interest. For example, somebody's wife is a real estate agent. She has a contract to sell houses in this particular development, and this person is advocating for a change in that zone to increase the property value. That might be more direct conflict. It also is any types of conflict of interest. It is the individual's decision to determine whether that conflict exists and whether they need to remove themselves or absent themselves from the vote. It doesn't mean if they don't do it that they're not subject to an ethics complaint or a potential ethics violation, but that decision lies with the individual. Okay, pop quiz. There's an open position on the Planning and Zoning Commission in a commission form of government. A commissioner would really like to be appointed to the commission. Most of the commissioners are in favor of the commissioner taking the planning and zoning spot, but Commissioner Troublemaker, basically, objects, stating that a member of the legislative body cannot serve on the planning commission because legislative body reviews planning and zoning decisions. What do y'all think? It's true. Yeah. And there's a court case to that effect. One of the problems with state law sometimes is that incompatibility or this type of conflict, it's not clearly defined for absolutely every single board or commission or position of employment or what have you, and then case law comes along and helps us out, but you read the statute and that doesn't answer the question fully. So here are some statutory boards that are available to cities: Code Enforcement, Planning Commission, Board of Adjustments, a Vacant Property Review Commission, if you have one, Parks and Recreation, Historic Preservation Commission. These are all of the statutorily authorized boards. Urban Renewal and Community Development, Local Development Authority, and you'll get a copy of the PowerPoint, by the way. Industrial Development Authority, Economic Improvement Management District, which we don't have many of those, but there are some. Housing Authority, Airport Board, Riverport Authority, Mass Transit Authority, Tourism and Is it working? Yeah, there we go. Okay, utility boards and commissions, Joint Water Commission, Metropolitan Sewer District Board. And if you guys ever feel like you have too many boards and commissions, just think of poor Paducah. Paducah has an unreasonable number of commissions. They have close to 20 commissions. I mean, if they only have 2 boards, then yeah, or 2 meetings a year, then yeah, probably. But also you want to look at the board rules. Has the board notified members, hey, we expect you not to miss more than X number of meetings a year? Or is that even in your ordinance or, you know, how it's been established? Can the mayor appoint his ex-brother-in-law to the board? Well, maybe he got the brother-in-law in the divorce. You never know. You know, yeah. I mean, it's going to depend on what the statute says and the like, but generally, yeah, that's not going to be an issue. So a couple of things here to point out is that you can, as a city, you can make the decision to restrict the number of meetings that a member of the board or commission can miss. However, you want to be really careful. And we talk to cities about this regularly. The recommendation that we've kind of developed is, yeah, you might want to say, if you miss 2 meetings, then the individual should be reaching out to the chairperson to talk about the reason for the absence. Because nobody wants to be the commission board of commissioners that removed little Miss Mabel, who had cancer and was in the process of being treated. You know, we don't want to be that. We don't want to be that group. So we always recommend, first thing, if people are missing meetings, the mayor should call them and find out why. Is everything okay? Can we help you? What's going on? Do you have, you know, did you overcommit yourself? Do you have a lot of obligations? And this is something that you need to kind of leave behind and for us to find somebody else. That's preferable to removal almost every time. So city-created boards, there's also boards that you can create under home rule authority. It gives cities latitude to create boards and commissions as long as there's no conflict with the Constitution or with state law. So the key that we talked about earlier is you cannot delegate to a board any legislative or executive authority. So you can have a finance committee to look at areas of the city where they think the city should improve things, or even to make suggestions on the budget, but you can't give them the authority to craft the budget, right? That's statutorily assigned. So a lot of what we see, we'll see a budget and finance committee on occasion. And again, these are just, they're compiling information, reviewing data, and then providing information to the commission. A downtown restoration commission, you can have one of those. Cemetery board, a lot of cities end up taking over older cemeteries, so you may have a cemetery board. A tree board, you would be amazed at how many cities have a tree board. And special events committees. So you may have a 4th of July parade committee. That's still a committee of the city, created by legislative or executive action or by ordinance. So they're usually created by executive or municipal order. They can be created by ordinance, but you don't have to if it's for that. So the committees that are created by the legislative body, they can address things like review and make recommended changes to the disciplinary process for the employees, okay? They can do that, but not an executive committee to determine the number of vacation and sick days for employees. So they can't be the ultimate decision-making body. That has to be reserved back to the Board of Commissioners. Okay, city order can set up the terms for membership. You can appoint. One thing, this happened a few years ago, we used to say under open meetings that the first meeting of a city-established board doesn't have to be set when it's created. And the Attorney General disagreed with us. And so you want to at least start by saying, maybe for a 4th of July committee, when you do the executive or legislative order, you're going to say, hey, they're going to meet at least once a year on June 15th. And then every other meeting they have is going to be a special called meeting if they're having a public meeting. But you do have to set the regular time and place that they are going to have their meetings according to state law. So open meetings and open records apply to all committees, commissions, boards, and the like. The meetings have to be properly noticed, minutes have to be kept, votes recorded, and it's important to, like I said, to establish the meeting date and time. And they can follow the same kind of Robert's Rules of Order that the city follows, or modified version, which is what we generally recommend. And there's no requirement that they have bylaws, and they cannot have taxing or fee-setting authority. Okay, so the city manager wants to establish a city suggestion committee to review suggestions provided to the city and decide which suggestions the city will adopt. Adopted suggestions will result in an award of a $500 gift card. City manager issues an executive order creating this committee and program. Can the city manager create this committee? No. Are there any other issues with this process aside from the executive order? Yeah, the $500 is not great. Yeah. What about the fact that the committee is going to decide which suggestions the city is going to adopt? Yeah, I can't do that either. Okay. Now, if you're awarding somebody a negligible amount for an idea, you can do that because it wouldn't be considered an unauthorized bonus because it would be compensation for something additional. So you could do a negligible amount. $500, that better save the city some money, that idea. right? Okay. Special purpose governmental entities, and we get a lot of questions about these. So it is any agency, authority, or entity created or authorized by statute that exercises less than statewide jurisdiction, exists for the purpose of providing one or more limited services. It's governed by a board, council, commission, and a whole other host. But it has policy-making authority separate from the state and the governing body in which it operates. Tourism commissions are special purpose governmental entities. It's a clear example, right? So it has, some of them have independent authority to generate public funds, or they receive and expend public funds. That can include grants and the like. So these are the types of SPGEs that exist. So you have ambulance, emergency, fire protection services, flood control, drainage, levee, water conservation, area planning, management. I didn't shrink this enough, sorry. Community development services, library services, public health, public mental health, public hospital services. I'm not gonna read the rest of it to you, y'all can read. But these are the types of boards, committees, commissions that are created that are special purpose governmental entities. If they are given a specific budget by the city, or like I said, in the event of the Tourism Commission, by statute, they create their budget and submit it to the city for approval. So they're not cities, counties, school districts, they're not any of these entities that are considered, quote, kind of subdivisions of the state. Fire protection districts and volunteer fire department districts, they are not. And this is all taken from the definitions of special purpose governmental entity in the statute. So, breaking it down for you, these are the ones that you're frequently going to have in a city. Tourist commissions, utility commissions, sanitary or sewer commissions, although we don't have a ton of those. Park boards, ambulance boards, IDAs, economic development authorities, public transportation, and conservation districts. Those are the majority of what you're going to find in cities. But not the airport boards, fire protection district, under Chapter 75, which is a little different. Those are the volunteer fire departments or emergency ambulance taxing districts. Okay? Okay, mayor's at her wit's end with the Tourist and Convention Commission. She tries working with the ED to create projects to promote and attract tourism to the city and feels stonewalled at every angle. Meanwhile, the Tourism Convention Commission is sitting on a substantial amount of money that the mayor believes should be used and not just accumulated. She tells the TCC that the city has to approve the budget along with expenditures, and the ED tells her to pound sand. Mayor then states that the Tourism Convention Commission has not required the auditor to present the TCC audit to the city council, and that violates state law. Who's correct? The mayor. So what can be done? A couple of different things. The city can disband the Tourism Convention Commission. The city can file complaints with the Attorney General's office. They can file a complaint with the state auditor's office and have the state auditor come audit the Tourism Convention Commission. But realistically, what we've seen, and we've had these situations where Tourism Convention Commissions kind of go wild a little bit, is to start reaching out to the Tourism Convention Commission themselves and not just dealing with the executive director, and talk to them about what's required, okay? Because really what you want from the Tourism Convention Commission, their job is to promote the city and bring tourism to the city. So developing that working relationship with the commission itself and kind of moving forward and trying to get them into compliance, that's generally more beneficial than just reporting them. And we've seen it happen in several places. And so far, we haven't had to have them audited or go through that whole process to report. So special purpose governmental entities are required to register with the Department for Local Government and provide reports to DLG. It requires significant financial disclosures. They are highly regulated and everything goes to DLG. So effective January 1, 2021, any special purpose governmental entity with taxing or rate setting authority has to submit the proposals to the entity that created the taxing district for approval. So this is a direct result of complaints that some of these special purpose governmental entities were raising taxes and nobody knew why. Or they were raising rates and not really getting approval. So now the legislative body has to approve, okay? And then there are a whole host of other exceptions to requiring the approval for the fee. But to my knowledge, y'all have not had this issue with any of the taxing entities in your city. Have y'all had this, Earl? No, okay. So the Department for Local Government, the role is to oversee and design the creation of a submission of a form. And they do have an online portal that is finally active. Receive and maintain the SPG registration, receive annual audits. SPGEs are required to have an annual audit, okay? And that's their website, and then a contact information for special purpose governmental entity. So do y'all have any questions about the boards, commissions, committees? Earl, was there anything you wanted to ask or? All right. They do have to be. Well, these are different types of airport boards operating under a specific statute. So yeah, sorry. They're usually no, it's the regional authority. So the good news is, I can tell you honestly, DLG does not want everybody's junk mail. So if they didn't have to report, DLG would reach out and go, you don't have to send me this.
Those audits are expensive. Don't they have to hit a certain budget before they have to do anything? Otherwise they can wait 4 years or 5 years?
Not SPGEs, but cities can. Yeah.
That's a big expense.
It's a huge expense. Okay, the city manager form of government, which is what y'all operate under. So the various forms of municipal governments in Kentucky, we have the mayor council, which is the majority of cities operate under mayor council form of government. And that's hallmarked by a mayor that runs the city, you know, a strict separation of powers between the mayor and the executive authority and the legislative authority in the city council. I can tell you a lot of times what we see, and then the commission form is very similar to city manager, except you don't have somebody running the city. The commission as a whole runs the city. What we see a lot is in a mayor council form of government, the council members want to act like commissioners and run the city. And in a commission form of government, sometimes the commissioners don't want to assume any executive authority and want the mayor to run the city. So it's interesting how it kind of unwinds. We also have the mayor alderman, and we do not have any city with that form. Louisville is the only city that could opt to do the mayor alderman form, and they're not. Urban county government, consolidated local government, charter county government, unified local government, and the one we're going to talk about, city manager. So these are the cities that operate under the city manager form of government. And you can see they're all about the same size. Owensboro and Paducah are outliers just because of, due to the size. But the rest of them are about the same size as Danville with a little difference here and there. So the key features, 5 elected officials. Together, y'all make up the Board of Commissioners. So you have 1 mayor, 4 commissioners. And there's no separation of the executive and legislative authority. And we have your city manager. So we're going to start, the city manager is the chief administrative officer. So that means he exercises all executive authority on behalf of the Board of Commissioners that's given by statute. Ultimate executive authority, though, rests with y'all. So, but the city manager manages the day-to-day operations of the city. And it's important that separation is purposeful. So the legislative body, the Board of Commissioners, y'all have something of a separation from the day-to-day operations. The mayor is a member of the Board of Commissioners. Full rights to introduce legislation, which in a mayor council form of government, they cannot. So you can introduce, and I put an extra S in there. You can introduce legislation, vote on all matters coming before the Board of Commissioners, and you're counted for determining a quorum. Not so in a mayor council form of government. You preside over meetings as of the Board of Commissioners. As the mayor, you may call special meetings. A majority of the members of the commission can as well. And you're the appointing authority to some agency board. So some, like I said, there's a small number, but they will say the mayor appoints and then the legislative body affirms. The mayor is also required to sign all notes, bonds, contracts, or other written obligations and meeting minutes of the Board of Commissioners. The mayor acts as the ceremonial head of the city and is recognized by the governor for purposes of military law. And non-legal roles as political head of the city government. So mayor, you get to be at the head of every parade. One of the things that came up, however, when we've had some of the emergencies that we've had with the pandemic and then the tornadoes and the flooding, is that when there is a state of emergency declared, the mayor, even in a city manager form of government, you become the executive, period, bottom line, end of sentence. So there's no distinction for the mayor's role during a state of emergency in any form of government. The mayor would then, for all intents and purposes, is the executive authority. And by statute, you are the only person who can declare a state of emergency on behalf of the city and issue executive orders to continue the operation of the city. So, Board of Commissioners. Absolutely, sir. Yes, sir. Can't do that. Only in your absence, yes, sir. Yes, sir. And that's by state law. Then the remaining legislative body, the remaining members of the legislative body, because 3, that constitutes a quorum, they would select an individual to serve in both y'all's absence. Sorry. Yeah. It's a very rare circumstance, and I should have gone through those statutes and it's a very rare circumstance where the statute requires the mayor to appoint, as opposed to, most of the time in statute, it'll say the city by executive authority appoints, and then the legislative authority approves. There are very few circumstances where it says mayor. And I should have pointed out specifically what they were. They're very obscure.
Ours kind of works as the mayor makes the recommendation to you all as board, and you all vote on it.
Oh, yeah. Of course. Of course. There's nothing wrong with that. Hey, how are you? Good. So the Board of Commissioners, that's all y'all. You have to hold regular meetings, the Board of Commissioners, at least once a month, and it's in your ordinance what those are. At such times and places as designated by ordinance, which is this room, obviously. You may call special meetings of the board upon written request of the majority of the commissioners. So let's say the mayor doesn't call a special meeting for whatever reason, and 3 of the remainder of y'all want to call a special meeting. Then you submit a written request and call the special meeting. And it is not a violation of the Open Meetings Act for the Board of Commissioners to discuss meeting times, places, any type of administrative function, what y'all want to have for lunch, you know, whether it needs to be part of a special meeting, whether you need to have that discussion, as long as you don't go so far as to discuss the actual topic and how you're going to vote, right? So when it talks about trying to make sure that y'all don't inadvertently have a meeting without having a meeting, there's a lot of flexibility, okay? Especially when you're talking about administrative circumstances for the Board of Commissioners. You just can't get too heavily into the meat of the conversation. And that's because under the Open Meetings Act, which we're going to cover part of that today, the whole purpose is to make sure that the public's business is done in the sunlight, right? And that the public is aware of the conversations that go on as much as possible. I agree with that. You're talking to somebody who's in bed by 9 o'clock, so yeah, I'm in full favor. All right. So the Board of Commissioners designate, oh yeah, of course.
We've had instances before where there have been some desire for special call meetings. And it's been our position that that form in writing that we take seriously, but that it's not just said, hey, Commissioner A, B, and C want to meet on this issue, that it actually be a writing that is signed by those individual commissioners. So saying that Commissioner A, B, and C want to have an issue does not rise to the level of the statute, in our opinion. So we require that actually be in writing, signed by 3 commissioners, not just a 3 of us want to meet.
Should they also have to put the topic into the special call meeting?
Yeah, they have to decide the topic, because that means it was not being scheduled upon the consent of the city manager or the mayor. Yeah.
And yes, the topic definitely has to be included, and that's a legitimate interpretation of the statute. Absolutely. And yeah, when it says in writing, it means it has to go to the city manager, the mayor, and usually the city clerk as well. So. Okay, so the Board of Commissioners, and y'all have already done this, you designate 1 commissioner to serve as the mayor pro tem to act in place of the mayor. And the good news for y'all is the mayor pro tem, unlike in a mayor council form of government, which does not have a mayor pro tem, even though they frequently say a member of the council's mayor pro tem, but that's fine. You actually have full authority. So you can sign contracts, sign checks, and take on the role that's required normally of the mayor. The reason that's important is in a mayor council form of government, to ensure continuation of business in the hopefully unlikely event that the mayor is incapacitated, they have to assign that to a city employee by executive order. Here, the mayor pro tem, you don't have to jump through those hoops, and the mayor pro tem has the authority to take on all of those terms and conditions of the mayor's duties. So it's usually done each term, so each 4-year term by a vote of the board and placed in a municipal order or by resolution. And we talked about you have all the rights, duties, responsibilities of the mayor. So the Board of Commissioners is also required to adopt an annual budget ordinance and levy taxes and this is important, state law requires the board to provide adequate revenue to operate city government. And we will get this call frequently when people get upset with one another. Be like, well, we're just not going to include that in the budget. Like, we're mad at at Public Works, so we're just gonna write them out of the budget. No, you can't do that, right? You can't just shut down your city government because you're mad at people. And the Board of Commissioners can enact codes, rules, regulations to provide for the public health, safety, and welfare. And so in that instance, we're talking about, code enforcement, planning and zoning, other types of rules and regulations to keep your citizens safe, and establish all appointive offices. So cities have both non-elected officials, so your city manager, non-elected office, city clerk, non-elected office, police chief, fire chief, all non-elected offices. Those have to be established by city ordinance as well, and they are in your city, and they are appointed and ratified through the Board of Commissioners. And you are to establish the responsibilities of all those offices. Now, the majority of your ordinances, and nothing is wrong with it, just simply refer to the statutory authority or statutory duties and responsibilities that are in state law. And a lot of cities, that's what they do. Y'all can include more specificity. I don't recommend it, because when you do that, then the next person comes along and you may want to change it. Then you've got to change your ordinance, right? You vote to fill appointive officers and positions of employment. So the city manager, and we'll talk about this when we get to his roles, responsibilities, and duties. The city manager recommends to the board, hey, these are the people that I recommend you hire. City manager is going to do all of the interviewing, taking applications, do all the legwork, which I know is exhausting. I've done it a million times. It's not a fun part of the job. And then recommend to the Board of Commissioners, here's who I recommend for these positions. And then it's y'all's responsibility to authorize the hiring of that individual, as well as any removal or termination. And I left out an R. Y'all, I don't know what happened to me when I was typing, but apparently I should have given this to Mei Ling for her to edit. I think I've created so many of these that I don't see my own typos until I get up here. So any removal, so any termination of any employee, that also comes before the board based upon the city manager's recommendation. The Board of Commissioners may require into the conduct of any department, office, or agency of the city, including requiring submission of sworn statements. But this is what I call the nuclear option. The majority of the information from city operations should come through the city manager, because it's his job. Y'all have hired him to run the city, to do his job. So, and I'm sure department heads provide you with regular updates. Do they? Yeah. Not unusual. But when you get to the point where you are investigating in a department of the city and you're asking them for sworn statements, that shows your city employees that you have lost trust in how the city operates. And there are other mechanisms to get that information before you go that far. So you can do that, and the statute definitely anticipates it. But when you get to that point, your city attorney definitely needs to be involved, and you're investigating a department is what it comes down to for malfeasance, misconduct, or potential criminal activity of some kind. So you establish compensation by ordinance for elected and non-elected officers. And I will tell y'all, the little boxes, I try to make sure that I put the statutes I've referenced for each slide. That way, in your spare time, because I know you'll have lots of it, right? You can check my work. But the compensation of city employees and non-elected officers has to be in ordinance, okay? In the personnel and pay classification plan ordinance. Don't panic. This can be in your budget, okay? The pay and classification plan ordinance can be your budget because your budget contains, it's an ordinance that frequently contains a lot of that information. It may not. You may have a separate pay and classification ordinance. If you do, one of our recommendations for different positions is to make sure that you provide a wide range of salary. And the reason we recommend that is so that you don't have to go back and amend another ordinance every time that inflation surpasses your pay band. Because by law, you cannot pay your employees outside of their pay range. And that happens in a lot of cities where they have a specific pay range and suddenly they've been getting, cost of living adjustments and everybody in the city is outside of their pay band. It's not great, right? So it's always good if you have those pay bands to make sure that you have, 2, 3, 5-year review if those are how your city operates. The compensation of elected officers, this has to be set by ordinance no later than the first Monday in May in the year that the officer is elected, and it can't be changed during their term of office. So if y'all want to give the entire Board of Commissioners a raise, go for it. But do you have anybody up for election? I guess we're in time for that. So if you want to do that now, you can do it, and then people who come in November, they would get it. But if you wait until May 15th, then you can't, right? And that really is, it's pretty blatant why that's the case, right? To make sure that people don't get into office and then just raise their pay. You.
This is the year in which the officer was elected.
Yeah, so if they're going to be elected in November 2024, the salary has to be adjusted by May 1, 2024.
So that keeps it an election issue.
Yeah, it does. And that's one thing we do tell people. For example, in Elizabethtown, their city council decided to raise the pay for the mayor, okay? They did it in an off year where there wasn't an election. That way there was no question. Now, that meant he didn't get the raise for a couple of years, but sometimes that can be helpful, to make sure that you do it prior to, so who knows if you would even run again, right? But it always does keep it an election issue.
Not just an election, a primary issue.
And sometimes a primary issue, yeah. But the other thing to remember is that for elected officials, you can also adopt a city ordinance that authorizes an annual cost of living adjustment. And that cost of living adjustment is the amount that the Department for Local Government authorizes every January. And it's based on the national COLA. So the other thing the Board of Commissioners that y'all are responsible for is to fill vacancies occurring in the office of mayor and commissioner due to death, resignation, disqualification by residency. So if during somebody's term of office they move out of the city, then you're going to have a vacancy. Or final conviction of certain felonies. Okay, acceptance of an incompatible office or removal from office for other reasons. You're also required to create the office of city manager, which you've done, and set the qualifications for office and any other additional duties. And again, y'all have kept it pretty consistent with state law. You would have to have a full change of government by referendum vote. I know. Probably not.
Kevin, you want to introduce that the same meeting you do your raise?
It's a great idea. And appoint a city manager by majority vote. Okay. So, any questions about those duties? All right. City manager. So as a qualification for office, the state law is going to require professional and administrative qualifications with special reference to actual experience in or knowledge of accepted practice regarding duties of the office. Do y'all have any idea what that means? Yeah, no. It's a word salad, right? So it generally means do the best you can to hire somebody who at least has some idea of how to run a city, right? And they have some professional training. So do they have a degree in public administration? Or do they have some experience? Do they have some experience within the city? Have they run a city department? There are a wide range of qualifications that can constitute professional training and administrative qualifications. Sometimes cities will establish specific criteria in city ordinance. Sometimes they don't. We have some cities that have established the criteria in city ordinance, but they couldn't get any applicants to meet that criteria, and then had to turn around and amend their ordinance. So I don't recommend requiring certain levels, or getting really hung up on what those qualifications should be. But you want somebody who can demonstrate that they have the ability, the background, training experience to run the city. Okay, and you can, like I said, you can include different qualifications, but we had one city where they required somebody to have a master's in public administration, and the city just didn't pay enough to attract someone with that qualification. So, kind of have to be careful what you wish for. So the city manager is appointed for an indefinite term by a majority vote of the members of the board, which means employment at will. This doesn't mean you can't have a contract. It just means they can still be terminated at will, but a court may order you to pay out a contract. City manager may only be removed by majority vote of all members of the board. And there is a significant process. So, Commissioner Cottle, sorry. Is it Cottle or is it? Yeah. Okay, I was going to say. Have to adopt a preliminary resolution stating the reasons for removal. Has to be adopted by a majority vote of all the members. The manager can reply in writing to the allegations and request a public hearing that has to be held within 30 days. After the public hearing, if any, the board may adopt a final resolution of removal by majority vote of all the members. So this does not mean by a majority of a quorum. When the statute says a majority vote of all members, that means all 5. Okay, so you're going to have 3 that are voting. Well, voting to remove, right? Okay, so the city manager is the chief administrative officer, and he has a lot of duties, a lot of jobs. He's required to enforce the city manager plan, city ordinances, and statutes. And I missed a T there. Y'all, I'm killing myself here with this. Promulgate procedures subject to board approval. So what would that look like? So when you're talking about procedures, let's say he wants to institute a new process for paying certain bills to the city. He's going to go out, he's going to do the research, he's going to say, based upon my administration of the budget, what I think is the proper way to do this, this is what we're doing, and you guys would approve, right? That's what he's going to do. Prepares the budget for the board. So in June, city manager prepares the budget, and the budget message presents it to the board. And then once the budget is adopted by the board, the city manager administers the budget within the confines of the budget itself. Prepares financial statements and administrative activities report at the end of each fiscal year. So those will be provided to y'all. And he's going to give you guys regular updates. That's not going to be the only time you hear from him about the financial status of the city. Keep the board advised of the financial condition and future needs of the city and making suggestions as they see fit. And that's going to include, potential appointment, creation of new positions that may be necessary for the efficient function of the city, any types of policies and procedures that the city manager thinks might assist the city in moving forward, and maintaining a liaison with related units of local government. So with the county, with other cities, with the state, and respecting interlocal contracting and joint activities. So do y'all have any interlocal agreements? I think you do with Boyle County a little bit, and probably some other.
Actually, a really important note, your second bullet point for us in our efficiency, where we deviated from that in the past, it's called significant problems, when the city manager has not been utilized for that liaison type of activity. And when we've had commissioners that have interacted directly with magistrates in an attempt to do certain things, it's become very problematic and underscored a lot of problems in future maintenance of those interlocal agencies.
Yeah, and that can cause a lot of problems. One thing to remember that we emphasize continuously is that as a member of the Board of Commissioners, you only have official authority while you're seated as a member of the board at a meeting. Once you leave the meeting, you don't get some magic wand is waved and you get stripped of your title when you walk out the door. That's not it. But you no longer have authority as a commissioner of the city. That also can have legal implications because your immunity status changes. So under the Claims Against Local Governments Act, you have immunity for decisions made and legislative, quasi-judicial decisions made when you're seated as a board, but not when you leave because you're no longer cloaked in the official authority in your capacity as commissioner for the city. And when it comes to things like the role in economic development authorities, industrial authorities, how the city interacts in those circumstances, it's not that y'all are never going to interact with the fiscal court. That's not it. But the city manager needs to be engaged in conducting and heading and leading any of those negotiations on how the cogs in the wheel function and what that looks like. Because it undermines the city's bargaining authority, too, if you have too many cooks in the kitchen. As an attorney, if I'm negotiating with a client, or not with a client, if I'm negotiating on behalf of my client, and then somebody else comes in the room and undermines the individual's authority, then I know I'm in the catbird seat. I can play them against each other. I can do whatever I want, and I can get the best deal on behalf of my client. And that's the kind of situation that the city can end up in, to your point.
And I like that because when we've had pushback on that point and throughout, time, because the magistrate doesn't lose their cloak, to use your word, and they leave the chamber. So it's vastly different. So they're like, well, we do it. Why can't you do it? So it makes you feel like, well, maybe I should do that, but you can't. And so when we tell you and provide instruction or sometimes admonishment for those types of activities, it's not only for efficiency of local government, it's for your protection for the immunity piece that she pointed out. It's not to be meant as a restriction against you. It's meant to be a preservation of the integrity of our very.
And I will also say that those magistrates are not acting in the city's best interest when they try to pick you off one by one and change your mind.
Haven't found that yet.
Nope. Okay, so the city manager, and we kind of talked about this already, he's going to recommend to the Board of Commissioners appointment and removal of employees. He may fill vacancies in classified service. You guys don't have classified service. Don't even think you might want it. Just trust me on this, okay? Just be like, yay, we don't have it. May fill temporary positions of employment as authorized by the board. So you may have temporary positions are 9 months. And the reason we say 9 months is because that's what Kentucky retirement system says. So it's going to be defined in your personnel policy probably as 9 months. So, and these are going to be seasonal employees, like you may have some people who work in your parks or your lifeguards, what have you. Supervises all departments, officers, and employees. And again, the city manager needs to be the one supervising them and then reporting progress, conditions, what have you, to the Board of Commissioners. And require all departments to make reports. So that's why the department heads come and make reports to the Board of Commissioners. Must perform any other duties assigned under the ordinance creating the position, and y'all didn't add any duties. And again, I don't recommend you add any duties necessarily. The city manager's duties can only be delegated to subordinate officers and employees pursuant to a municipal order adopted by the board. So if the city manager has to leave the country for a few months or what have you, somebody's still got to oversee the government, right? And that can be delegated, but the board has to sign a municipal order to do that. All right, and we found out some of the cities who have a city manager form of government, they said, hey, we don't like the fact that if we do an evaluation of the city manager, it's not like having one boss. We have to evaluate the city manager in open session. And that's not fair. JD doesn't evaluate me in front of the entire KLC staff. Thank goodness, because I'm not perfect. Who is, right? So in 2022, we amended the city manager form of government to include a section that allows the Board of Commissioners to go into closed session for twice a year, no more than twice a year, to evaluate the city manager's performance with the city manager. Now, any record, so if you do a formal evaluation, if you take notes, what have you, any of the written documentation would then be subject to open records, depending upon the restrictions in open records. But that gives you more latitude to shut the door and have a conversation with your employee, so to speak. So, and a lot of cities have found that valuable. Even if it's an attaboy, because Earl does do a good job, but it still gives you that opportunity to have that evaluation and to talk that through. Okay, do y'all need a break? You tell me. You want a break? You can get a break. You can push on through. Yeah, again. All right, let's take a 10-minute break, or we'll break until y'all get back in. How about that? Is personnel issues. And this comes up all the time with elected bodies. So what do you do for personnel issues, right? And then that's going to run through your city manager. Some of the biggest points that we make are to seek legal advice, number one, for all personnel issues, know the city's policies, and know whether they're up to date. And that's really important because we have seen, I've reviewed some city policies, for example, personnel policies that require somebody to sign a report before the city reviews a claim of harassment or discrimination. And that's no longer the case. That's actually a violation of federal law, okay? So it's important to make sure that your city's policies are up to date and be aware of the limits on roles and authorities. And this gets back to the roles of commissioners and the mayor and a board of commissioner form of government in your official capacity. So there's a limited role in a city manager form of government for the board to have with personnel. Board of Commissioners only act as members of a full body while in a public meeting and don't retain their legislative or executive authority individually when you leave. We kind of already talked about that. Legislative and executive qualified immunity is limited to circumstances in which you're acting in your official capacity. So again, that's when you're seated as a member of the Board of Commissioners. The statute places supervisory authority of departments and employees under the city manager. This doesn't mean that the city manager doesn't have to report to you or that information shouldn't flow to the Board of Commissioners. In fact, it should. And the reports should be regularly provided to the Board of Commissioners. But the city manager is responsible for keeping the commission informed, okay, of departmental and personnel matters. So, personnel responsibilities are pretty clear in statute and state law generally. City manager, supervise departments and conduct of all employees, recommend appointment, tenure, or removal of an employee to the board, recommend salaries, benefits of employees through the budget. The Board of Commissioners supervises the city manager, hire and remove employees after receiving the city manager's recommendation, establish personnel pay and classification plan by ordinance, which includes in the budget, and budget adequate revenue to operate the city and provide for orderly management. So those are the responsibilities of the board versus the responsibilities that are delegated to the city manager by statute. One of the things that has become more prevalent, and I don't have any reason to believe that this is happening here, but I'd just like to point it out, is not being aware of the impact on employee morale of public questioning of employees when they come before the board. And not just board, council, commission, what have you. And again, Earl didn't spill any tea. I don't have any reason to think that this applies to y'all, but I still want to point it out because it seems to be an increasing issue for some cities. So we've had situations, and they're on Facebook and on YouTube, where there's some pretty aggressive conversations and questioning of department heads or city employees when they come before legislative body. You know, city employees and government employees generally, they don't necessarily make a competitive salary, but they usually do it for the love of their job. Harsh public criticism by elected officials does tend to negatively impact employee morale generally. It doesn't mean that there can't be questions about reports or questions about city operations directed to those employees, but the harsh, combative criticism encourages the prevailing negative attitudes about any government employee as a bureaucrat. And that pervades. So it doesn't just stay with that department head. It can really impact the entire department and all the city employees. It doesn't. And again, the impact on city employees, and because it changes public perception of the city employees too. And that's hurtful. Consistent leadership provided by the city manager with leadership working together with the board, that provides employees with a stable understanding of the city's value, mission, and goals. So even though there can be turnover in the mayor, the board of commissioners in general, having the stability of knowing, as long as I'm doing X, Y, or Z, I'm okay, instead of, like you said, Commissioner, the gotcha moments, that really helps employee, that improves their morale by giving them that consistency, and they don't feel like they're on shaky ground. Like what I do today may not be okay tomorrow, but I've been told today that it's great. And clear, updated personnel policies that include non-financial incentives to recruit and retain employees, those also enable the city to compete with the private sector to recruit and retain good talent that stays in the city. And that's something that every city is looking at. What can we provide aside from the money, because we all have budget constraints? What can we do to incentivize people to stay? And then holding supervisors and department heads accountable for active, even-handed management, that also assures employees of a level playing field, which isn't always easy, but it's necessary. You know, we've all been in jobs where we have the manager with pets and favorites and people who can do no wrong. And even if you're not, sometimes people have that perception, and you know the impact that it has on you. So making sure that you're holding people accountable, this all improves the public morale, but leadership starts at the top. As much as we would like to think that people ignore us when we're in a leadership role, they don't. And so whatever example is set by the leaders, that's what permeates with the public employees. And this also protects the board and the city manager from any type of liability claim, right? We do have situations, and I've been tracking some of the cases where there have been lawsuits against members of the legislative body for interfering in an employment relationship. Yeah.
When we're talking about the cloak, when you have an employee, there's on some level that is removed. If you have an employee that's reaching out to an individual commissioner trying to circumvent their chain of command. So, for example, if a firefighter goes around the fire chief and talks to a commissioner about something the fire chief presented at a commission meeting, at some point, there's some weird layer there with the cloak too, you're operating outside of the
Yeah,
public
the only
forum.
time the commission is cloaked with that authority, with the official authority as a city commissioner, is when they're seated as a member of the board.
Right, and what I've said before, and help me make sure this is, confirm this, what I've always said is that really that chain of command is to protect you as an elected official as much as it also is in the employee.
100%. And
Right.
where it gets gray is when you have employees who live in the city and they say, no, I'm contacting you as my representative and not as an employee of the city. Then you get into a gray area, but what,
It revolves around the content of what they're discussing.
bingo.
If they're talking about interagency problems, then that's wholly irresponsible of the employee and incumbent upon the elected official to stop the discussion. If they're talking about the increased property tax rate, that's maybe more legitimate, or trash pickup services or problems they're having there as any other citizen, that's probably fair game.
That's correct. And there's case law to that effect, as you know. Where public employees have been disciplined for going outside the chain of command, for presenting public information, and saying, I'm not acting in my capacity as an employee. Well, yeah, you are. If you're criticizing something the fire chief said in a city meeting and you're a firefighter, really? That's not in your capacity as a citizen. So that's why I say I can understand where it feels like a gray area, but the reality is that employee, if they're calling you about something that's specific to their work, that needs to be redirected. And it does. There are some cases that are percolating in various parts of the country where some employees are beginning to go to court and attacking members of legislative bodies for those situations. So do y'all have any questions about the personnel and the responsibilities, roles?
I don't know, but I think I've been trained by somebody in the room that if it's a citizen or if it's an employee that brings an issue up to me, I just always say, hey, talk to the city manager.
Yay.
For some reason, this sort of shuts it down, like, I'll see you later. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, sometimes it based on what it is, I'll say, okay, I can listen to this. And I'll say, oh, by the way, I'm gonna take this to the city manager, and I'll use your name as where I got it from, the source. So a lot of times I'll say, well, I'll take it to the city manager, got my name, you know.
Oh, yeah. My favorite is, well, I need to tell you something very important, but this is just between us. No, 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 no. Not just between us.
I can't give any answer.
No.
When I have listening sessions, I try to get them all to come to city hall, and listen to them so somebody else can see it coming and going. And then the standard caveat is that, hey, appreciate you sharing this with me, I'll take it to city manager.
You're 100% safe when you do that.
Yeah.
Because we're inclined, based upon our just being normal people, to try to be a problem solver and present a solution. But in your role, under this form of government, which says you shall have no administrative functions, you are violating our form of government by presenting a solution to any citizen. So, we hate to go so far as in saying that's illegal behavior on your part to do that, but I say it in that way in an attempt to shock you into saying that our form of government requires that, to not be a problem solver, but to be a funnel of an idea to the city manager.
Which is different than a fiscal court.
Wholly different. Who they can be problem solvers, because they maintain some individual sovereignty in the district in which they represent, but you don't. We feel like when we say these things, it's out of integrity for the form of government. It's not to try to beat you down or take things away from you. It's to protect the professionalism of the services that are provided in the city. And that's not aided or abetted by individual commissioners presenting solutions to citizen problems.
And one of the good things that, from myself, even before I assumed this position, is that when they call me back for follow-up, I'll always say, hey, I reported that to the city manager. Any follow-up that you're gonna get is gonna be from the city manager or somebody on his staff. Because that way I don't have to worry about going back 10, 15 times to someone.
Well, let me tell you a common thing that we hear then, a lot of times, and this is just for the group, is that we didn't hear back from Marshall, or we didn't hear back from the city engineer.
That's right.
Yeah. What people hate is to be told no. And so like if there's a situation where it's not something the city should spend tax dollars, mutual tax dollars to help resolve something, a lot of times the answer is no, and they don't like that. So what our experience is, and you are welcome to give me feedback, but like our experience has been, their immediate reaction is to strike out against that particular employee, whether it be a code enforcement officer, police officer, public works employee, whoever that is, that gave them that negative response.
Here's
And-
one final scenario too that is also very common. An individual may have in fact come to the city manager. They may have in fact involved counsel. They don't like their answer, so they come to you and say, well, I'm not getting what I want to, so I'm coming to you.
Yeah.
And so that resurfaces from time to time. And and the correct response still in there is, well, then our right step is for you to come address this publicly in front of the entire Board of Commissioners in the presence of that individual and council.
Yeah, they don't do that. Yeah.
And they typically tend not to, but if they feel strongly enough,
Yeah.
then that's what they should do. Because that's their place to have redress, but not in side channels.
Absolutely. And, over and above, the safest bet when you get these questions is, hey, I'm going to pass your name on to the city manager. Yeah. Thanks. Now, one thing I did want to point out with your personnel policies is, how long has it been since y'all have updated them?
We do them every year.
You do them every year? Okay. Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, we're currently reviewing them more comprehensively now.
Okay. Good.
Going back to what Steven said, and I appreciate it, because that was on my mind too.
Yep.
If they're not getting satisfaction over here, not gonna get it from me either. I always have respect for these four. Tell everybody, just don't tell me.
Yeah. And again, there is no conversation that's just between us. My favorite are the conversations that start out with, well, I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but yeah, you do. Yeah. Yeah, and it might be you. Run far, run fast.
It's hard,
It is hard.
but I just say, I promise I would listen.
Yep.
Sometimes I'll take notes, sometimes I won't take notes, but I will listen.
And then pass it on to the city manager.
Before we go off that, there's
Yeah.
one thing that does create conflict for us, and that sometimes, and I'm trying to think about some of our relationships with the county, for example. And what we've said for a couple of years is in governments and towns our size, it's difficult sometimes to understand what role each has. And sometimes when a magistrate, so it's, we're trying to communicate the understanding for the city commission because this is a city meeting. But sometimes a magistrate can come and talk to the city commission and then get frustrated with that commissioner because they feel like that they're being ignored by the commissioner. But in all reality, the commissioners maybe just adhering to what their statutory limitations are, right? And by not responding or by not addressing it. And that magistrate can be frustrated with you as an individual. But that's not your fault.
No. And again, my recommendation in those situations would be to pass on the magistrate's communication to the city manager for a response. And no, they don't understand the form of government. They have not learned the city form of government. I don't know how counties operate. Not in my wheelhouse. And I get this all the time. So we have a couple of mayors who came from a county background and be like, well, the first year, one of them in particular, well, I mean, the Department for Local Government used to help me with my budget when I was county judge executive. Be like, oh, okay. Guess what? You're on your own. Talk to your city clerk. Your city clerk probably runs your city anyway. But, hey, that's just not, it's a totally different function, totally different organization, totally different structure. And I've told JD a million times, I'm glad that we're Kentucky League of Cities instead of KCO, because KCO has to try to rally all the magistrates, all the county judges, all the sheriffs, all the county clerks, like all of these elected officials, and try to get one clear message and provide all that training and all that information. I'm happy to just deal with cities. Be glad. Could you imagine trying to run herd over an elected police chief or an elected fire chief instead of having them as an employee of the city? Yeah, so feel bad for your city manager, for your magistrates and your county judge. So, Open Meetings Act, and this is just kind of to hit home. I know y'all have all been to our COAs and our COOs and had the training, but it's always good to have a refresher on the Open Meetings Act before we really get into parliamentary procedure. And it starts with the business of the people shall not be conducted in secret, just like the Open Records Act. So people are supposed to be able to view and participate in the formation of local policy, and it acts on a check on the government's actions. So who has to comply? The Board of Commissioners. And also any committee, subcommittee, commission, or board created by the legislative body or the chief executive officer. And that's important because sometimes we want to create the 4th of July committee, but if we create the 4th of July committee by official action and we give them money, then they have to comply with the Open Meetings Act. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but you have to be prepared to make sure that they follow that structure. Any meeting of a quorum where action is taken and public business is discussed, or public business is discussed, sorry. So it has to be one of those two. Okay, that's why when emails are shared or text messages are shared, we always recommend don't have a group text because it's almost impossible to avoid the situation where you get into talking about the meat of the public business, right? So, okay, so we're gonna have a special called meeting and we're gonna talk about this particular topic. You know, Donna, what do you think about my proposal from last week to do blah, 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 blah? Inevitably, it happens. It's not intentional, but it can happen. And then unless the meeting is about a subject specifically exempted under open meetings law, and then it occurs in closed session. Okay, a series of less than quorum meetings where there is an intent to circumvent the act is also a violation of the Open Meetings Act. So you've had situations where people get creative and they're like, well, I'm going to talk to 2 commissioners today and then 2 commissioners tomorrow, and then the mayor and I are going to meet, so we won't violate the Open Meetings Act. But then we're not going to have to talk about this in an open meeting. No. That is a series of less than quorum meetings with the intent to evade the act.
How does that differ from instead of group texting, text each one individually?
That could be a series of less than quorum meetings with the intent to evade the act. So what our recommendation is the reason you want to text them individually is so somebody doesn't just reply, kind of like reply all, with information, and then people just start jumping in and unintentionally responding. But, and also, you may have a group text where it's like, well, where do y'all want to go to dinner after the meeting? Okay, that's not a violation of the act. Or, are we still getting donuts on Saturday morning together? Whatever. Not a violation of the act.
Could I text each one individually and try to get support for whatever I'm trying to push through?
Yes, you can lobby one another, but the important thing is, are you having conversations to ensure that you don't also have to have that same discussion with the general public present? Okay, so there's nothing wrong with lobbying for your proposed ordinance or proposal, but is it with the intent to evade the act? Are you trying to keep from having to say something in public? And if you have a question, reach out to your city attorney, because it can be a fine distinction. I can tell you that the Attorney General's office they try to be pretty forgiving when that happens, because a lot of cities do it on accident, but we've seen a lot of situations where they don't too. And if it becomes apparent, then they won't be forgiving. So there are certain gatherings that are not subject to the Open Meetings Act, conventions, conferences, training sessions where there's not a discussion. Like this contained a discussion of city business. So I always say if you're going to have a training session, I would err on the side of caution, because inevitably city business gets brought up, and that's okay. So there's nothing wrong with scheduling it as a special called meeting like this one was today and proceeding with the training. Social gatherings, donuts, a picnic, whatever, and meetings of less than a quorum where there's no intent to circumvent the law. And so if you have a committee or what have you where you have 2 commissioners that are going to sit on the committee, now that's going to be a separate committee, but that's not going to be published as a meeting of the Board of Commissioners, right? So how do you make it open? Times convenient to the public, places convenient to the public. And when it says times, basically, it means just don't have a meeting at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? We've had them later, as late as 9, 10 o'clock at night for whatever reason, and early in the morning, during the day. It's just generally within business hours or even in the evening, and you're fine. As long as it's like a big enough to accommodate everybody, that's fine. Yeah, liquor barn. There you go. Yeah.
What about giving out liquor samples to registered voters on election day?
No, not a problem at all. And never happened in Kentucky. Yeah. It's all fun and games. And it also has to be places convenient to the public. And the only time that this has really come up have been when there have been situations where you have a hot button issue and you know that 400 people are going to show up at your meeting, right? This room is not going to accommodate them. So you may need to have a special called meeting at the school gym or what have you. And that's happened for cities. And then geographic location. Generally, you're going to have it within the city, but there are exceptions. So, for example, if you know you're going to have one of those situations where you're going to have hundreds of people show up, and maybe you don't have a facility within the city that can hold that number, then you can have that special called meeting outside of city limits. You're just going to have to provide the public with notice, and it's only the 24-hour notice for the special called meeting, and justify why you need to have it at that location. Minutes have to be recorded of every action taken. So that's why you do roll call votes instead of, a lot of motions are going to be by voice vote, aye or nay. But if you're going to pass an ordinance, everybody's vote has to be taken and shown in the minutes. And that you cannot put attendance, you can't put conditions on attendance. Okay? So you can't say, we're going to have a commission night, and it's only going to be Republicans, or only Democrats, or only Rotary Club members. No conditions. And then the press has the right to cover the meetings, and it's a lot easier now. When we first started doing this presentation, microphones and cameras were a little bit more obtrusive than they are these days with your iPhone, as long as they don't interfere with the meeting. So they can put a recorder up there, they can put a microphone up at your desk, but they can't disrupt the meeting or make it difficult for the meeting to be conducted. Okay, we talked about regular meetings, have to be scheduled at least once a month. Schedules made readily available to the public. That means by ordinance. And when they're rescheduled, they're special meetings. We covered most of this, so written notice has to be provided for special meetings to all members of the legislative body and any of the media who have requested to receive the notices 24 hours in advance. It also has to be posted. Okay, and when y'all were elected, you probably got a request to sign to agree to receive the meeting notices by email. It's because it's easier on everybody. And so those will be provided to you. And this is everything that has to be included on the special meeting notice.
Starting time and ending time, he got irritated because we didn't see the time that we had.
Sounds like a personal problem. Yeah. He was just looking for a reason to complain. So exceptions,
For us to have end times, but I think in that particular meeting, weren't we conducting interviews or something? And like back to back, we were trying to like say, we're just doing one thing at this time, and next one, but we don't do end times anymore after that, just to prevent confusion, but I feel like we were stacking interviews or something like that, but.
Yeah, I mean, he was just looking for something to complain about. So exception to Open Meetings Act, and this means when you can go into closed or executive session, whichever you call it. Deliberations on acquisition or the sale of property. So the reason this is in there is because if the city says, we have budgeted $100,000 to purchase a piece of property, how much do you think you'll pay for the property if that's made public? $100,000. So, to give the city some type of latitude. Discussion on proposed or pending litigation, and this has to be more than just some anticipation. Okay, there has to be some cognitive reason, something more than just, little Miss Mabel tripped over a crack in the sidewalk outside of City Hall and we're pretty sure she's going to sue. Something more than that. Discussions which may lead to the appointment, discipline, or termination of an individual. So you still have to take the final vote outside of closed session, but you can have the more in-depth discussions in closed session. And again, that's also part of the reason why the city manager evaluation was placed in closed session for that very purpose, so that everybody can have pretty open discussion. Not because you're going to terminate him. Okay, discussions with a business entity when openness would jeopardize the siting, retention, expansion, or upgrading of that business. This is usually for economic development purposes when the city is attracting a potential business to move into the city. And of course, if people knew property values are going to go up, or there could be outside competition from locals to, take that property or somehow profit from the business location. Okay, in the closed session, it has to convene in a properly noticed open session. This does not mean that you can't have closed session during a special meeting. And I got this question the other day because it does say convene in a properly noticed open session. Doesn't mean a regularly scheduled meeting. It means an open session. So you can have a special called meeting with a closed session, but that means you have to open the meeting up for business. So you're still going to convene the meeting even if the only thing on the agenda is closed session for the purposes to discuss the acquisition of potential real estate. So you open it up, and then a motion has to be made to go into closed session. It has to be seconded, and you go into closed session. You have to state the specific provisions of the KRS. Usually your city attorney can do that because I don't know of anybody with JD that knows all 16 sections by heart. So motion has to be made and carried by a majority of the quorum. No discussion of any business aside from the limited justification for going to open session. So none of that. Well, while we're back here, no, none of that. And no final action can be taken in closed session. So once you have the discussion, the final decision is made in open session. Or sometimes no action is taken. That happens. So if you're discussing pending litigation, you have an update from city attorney on what's going on. There may not be any action to take, but information that the Board of Commissioners needed to be aware of. Okay, do y'all have any questions? Okay, I'm wearing you down. I like it. Okay, conducting effective meetings. This is the exciting part of the presentation. And I'm kidding. So what happens is when we're talking about conducting effective meetings, it's really talking about the rules of parliamentary procedure. So how do you operate? How do you consider motions? How do you manage everything? The form of government does impact meeting operations. And the reason Board of Commissioner form of government operates very differently from mayor-council. Mayor-council, the mayor cannot propose legislation, and the mayor only votes on legislation when it comes to a tie. That's not the case in the Board of Commissioner form of government. Mayor, you can propose an ordinance. You're a full voting member. You should vote every single time. Okay? The mayor's the presiding officer, but it's still a meeting of the legislative body. And even though the mayor has expressed his desire to rotate presiding officer chair, You can't do it because the statute says it's your ball. I know you want to share. That's good. You have a good heart. So when you're talking about effective meetings, the goal is efficient, orderly, fair transaction of business. It's not a game of gotcha, not to be punitive, to shut people down. And it also encourages public awareness and involvement to have an efficient, orderly meeting. Kentucky statutes establish only very basic legal requirements for city meetings. Basically, that you establish your rules, okay? And Robert's Rules of Order is a good catch-all. However, we always encourage a modified Robert's Rules of Order because nobody in the state of Kentucky follows Robert's Rules of Order to the T, nor should you. It is a very stodgy little book, okay? So procedural rules. You, as a legislative body, and you don't do this in ordinance. It can be by municipal order. It can be by resolution. You adopt and adhere to what rules of order you want, okay? You can't adopt Robert's rules. Again, modified is always better. And you can supplement and tailor all the general rules to fit your needs, the commission needs. And I left council in there. And to be bound by general parliamentary law, okay? So roles in the meeting. City clerk, she's going to call the roll, keeps time, takes minutes, counts and reports the votes. The parliamentarian, do you have one? That was a joke. Nobody has a parliamentarian, okay? So allegedly, you could have a parliamentarian who is certified in Robert's Rules of Order and parliamentary procedure. Nobody has one. Lexington or Louisville, they might have one. But if you watch Congress when you're really bored or watch the General Assembly, occasionally there will be an objection and they'll have to have the parliamentarian of the chamber rule on a motion, right? You don't want to do that. This is a meeting of a city board of commissioners. So when I say Robert's Rules is kind of stodgy, that's kind of what I mean. So you have the presiding officer. We're going to pretend like this parliamentarian one doesn't exist. The presiding officer announces business, enforces rules, recognizes members to speak, states and puts to vote the motions. And then legislative body members introduce and second motions, debate issues, and vote on matters. So, rules of debate. Some of this is recommended. Well, all of this is recommended. Members must be cordial, avoid personal attacks, and it says avoid using names. You don't have to avoid using names, okay? Y'all know each other. I mean, in the General Assembly, you'll hear people say, honorable lady from Southgate. They never refer by their names. Never. I wouldn't go that far. Once again, you can use names or commissioner or what have you. Members can be allowed to speak up to twice for up to 10 minutes each on an issue. This can be helpful if your meetings are out of control. And again, I said this is just kind of general recommended rules that a city can go by. Time cannot be yielded. Cities can approve their own rules. So this is not the fallback. This is just, these are simple rules that we have seen help some cities when their meetings are going on until midnight, which happens. Okay. Basic procedural rules, all motions must be made by a member of the legislative body. So to go into closed session, somebody has to make the motion. Mayor, you can make the motion in the Board of Commissioners form of government. It has to be seconded and a majority vote aye. That can be by voice vote to go into a closed session. That's the unanimous. You can also do unanimous consent. So for example, you can say meeting minutes are approved by unanimous consent. That means that consent is assumed unless somebody objects. But that's something that you would want to adopt in your rules. You don't, because there's never going to be a vote unless somebody says, I object, we need to make this change to the minutes. And tie votes on motions are lost. Okay, mayor, council form of government, tie is the only time a mayor can vote. But you guys, everybody's going to vote.
I would say on the unanimous consent portion, we used to have a member in our community who would come and say, y'all didn't vote on that. You know, mostly to adjourn or things like that. And we would often say, we adjourn by unanimous consent. Are there objections? Be none, everybody just walk out. And remember, that really irked this particular individual who thought a voice vote needed to be had on every matter. But that's the reason why.
There's always that one person.
Yeah, that's right.
If you don't know who it is, that one person is you. Okay, so. And that does happen. So, and it doesn't mean that the motions are lost forever. And I can't think of a circumstance, well, there's some situations where, and that's usually not with an ordinance vote. I don't know of a situation where an ordinance or a motion couldn't be made again at the next meeting, just because it fails. Okay, so we are going to cover Robert's Rules of Order briefly, okay? Don't get too bogged down. Some people get really spun up. I'm going to recommend you don't get too bogged down in this, but it's good to have an idea of how it flows. Okay, there are main motions. There's bringing the question back for a vote, subsidiary, privileged, and incidental motions. We're going to talk about what those are. A main motion, all business is going to start as a main motion. So it's simply an item of business for consideration. Ordinances, resolutions, simple motions, break for lunch or dinner. It requires a second and cannot be made while another motion is pending. It can be debated, amended, adopted, or defeated. Oh, yeah. We're not playing the videos. I had videos in here, but we're not going to worry about playing them. Postpone indefinitely. To postpone a matter indefinitely, it stops consideration of the motion, which can then be reintroduced at another meeting. But you can just say, I make a motion to postpone indefinitely. It is the lowest ranking motion, meaning that it's not going to trump a motion to adjourn, for example. It requires a second. It is debatable. So if somebody seconds it, then it's open for debate. So you guys can talk about whether to postpone something indefinitely. This can occur, let's say that something is brought to the Board of Commissioners and you're thinking about it, and then you say, well, I'd really like more information. I would like some time to study the issue, maybe ask Public Works whether we want this street to be one way or what have you. And then you can make a motion to postpone it indefinitely, okay, by majority vote. So, and then there's a motion to amend. It's going to insert or delete or replace text. It's used the most often. So if somebody makes a motion, I make a motion that we adjourn for lunch, and somebody else says, and go to Papa John's, and somebody says, I'm not feeling Papa John's. I'm going to amend your motion, and let's go somewhere else. It outranks the postpone indefinitely, so you're amending the original motion. It requires a second. It's debatable and amendable, so you can amend the amended motion. This is where you need to make sure that people are tracking what the flip is being said, because this gets very confusing. This happens at KLC board meetings all the time, and it makes my head spin. I don't know how Tamita does it. She's amazing. Okay? So amending, to amend, it's primary, secondary. You have the primary motion to amend, so got to vote on that. Then you have the secondary motion to amend, so you're amending the amendment. It's kind of crazy. So it has to be germane to the original amendment. So it doesn't replace it. So you're not saying, I'm making a motion that we break for lunch and go to Papa John's. You're not saying, I make a motion that we push on through, don't break for lunch and then go to dinner. That would change it entirely. It has to be relate back, okay? All right. So these are the order motions are considered. And again, don't get too bogged up. So postpone indefinitely, or postpone definitely. This just says, hey, let's postpone this to the next meeting. So maybe you're coming to the end of the Board of Commissioners meeting and it's the last item on your agenda, but you know it's going to take a while for y'all to discuss. You can say, I make a motion, it's getting late, I make a motion that we postpone this until the next meeting. Postpone definitely, right? Requires a second, then y'all can talk about it, and then a vote. Limit or extend limits of debate. We've had situations where, you know, there's going to be a contentious issue and the body as a whole has to do this. And I did have a question from one mayor. Can I limit debate? No. No, you cannot. Can the legislative body as a whole adopt rules to say, we're only going to consider this particular situation for this amount of time? Yes. Yes, the body as a whole can. And that can be rules that you put in place for everything, or you can even vote on that at the beginning. I'm going to make a motion that we limit debate on this matter so that each member of the board has 3 minutes to talk on, twice or what have you. You can do that. It outranks postpone definitely, requires a second. It's not debatable. And it's amendable only by the time. So you can say, well, I don't think 3 minutes is enough. I vote to amend it to do 5 minutes. Okay, but it's going to require 2/3 majority of the vote. And the reason it requires 2/3 is because you're limiting debate, right? Or extending debate, if you already have that in the rule. Call for the previous question. So this requires an immediate vote. This is kind of when people get tired of hearing it, is when you do it. It can be used punitively when they don't want to hear from a member of the legislative body, but that's not great. So call for the previous question. It outranks a lot. So it outranks extend limits of debate. So when you look at them in rank order, call for the previous question, it's pretty high up there, right? So, and it's going to require an immediate vote. It does require a second, but it too requires 2/3 majority vote. And what you're going to see is that anything that is going to limit debate or limit, everybody's opportunity to talk, that's going to require 2/3 majority vote, which makes sense. Lay on the table. You want to watch this one. People confuse this with postpone indefinitely. It's really used to kill a motion, because if you lay something on the table, technically under Robert's Rules of Order, under strict reading, it dies after the next regular meeting. So it can't be considered again. Now, that's not actually true under Kentucky law. You guys are going to be able to consider whatever you want, but we see it a lot. Motion to lay on the table, because I think that just means we're going to postpone it until we want to bring it up again, which is fine. If you want to use it for that, use it for that. It's just not technically what it means. Call for the orders of the day or to enforce the rules. This requires the body to take up regular orders. It can be used to refocus the meeting when it kind of, digresses into mayhem, which doesn't happen that often, but it does. And the presiding officer rules. So if the meeting has really gone off tracks and somebody says, call for the orders of the day, then the mayor can decide, yeah, we're going to do that. We're getting back to the agenda. We're going back. We're getting back on track. And a question of personal privilege. This is another one. Room may be too hot, too cold. The meeting may have gone too long and you need a break. That's what that is, question of personal privilege. Question of personal privilege, I would like a 10-minute break. Question of personal privilege, I'm melting, it's too hot. And then the chair will say, yeah, let's take a 10-minute break and figure out what's wrong with the room. And adjourn. So This one, this cracks me up because if you watch, especially when they're getting mad at each other, General Assembly will do this. Congress doesn't do this as much. But you'll see they'll periodically, somebody will get cute, motion to adjourn, and the chair automatically has to deal with it. Because motion to adjourn outranks everything, right? So when somebody makes the motion to adjourn, it's not debatable. It does require a second, but it's not debatable, and you have to have a vote. And sometimes people use it to shut everybody up. Like, I'm tired of hearing from all of you, motion to adjourn, right? But it's a simple majority vote. Okay, fix the time and place of the next meeting. If you're gonna have a special called meeting, you may make a motion to do that. It's rarely used unless you guys want to talk about a special called meeting because you have your schedule of regular meetings. It does outrank adjourn. So if somebody did a motion to adjourn and you're not sure whether you're having your special called meeting, you could do that. And now we get to voting. So most motions are going to be by voice vote, right? But a majority of the quorum is going to carry. But 2/3 votes need a show of hands or rising to vote. So when you're talking about the motions, that require 2/3 majority, ordinances require a roll call vote. Any official action of the city requires a roll call vote because the clerk has to take those notes. Division can be called in close voice votes. And so what that means is, and you guys shouldn't have this, those are for larger bodies. You'll have a very vocal minority that's screaming and then be like, okay, we'll go ahead and do the roll call. Unanimous consent can be used, and we talked about why y'all don't do that anymore. And an important factor in the Commonwealth of Kentucky is abstentions are not, they count as votes. There is no such thing under Kentucky law as an abstention. If a member of the legislative body abstains from a vote, your vote is counted with the majority. Okay? So what you have to do in Kentucky, and there's just a lot of old case law, and it is what it is. We used to call it taking a walk in the General Assembly. So what that means is and they would literally take a walk. They would leave the chamber and walk around the hall until the vote was taken to avoid having to vote, so that they're not counted. But the issue is, you're also not counted for the purposes of a quorum if you take a walk, because it's a member of the legislative body taking some action to remove them from the voting process. Because that's what's required if you truly want to abstain, okay? And so, in general, and y'all seem like you get along pretty well, the group has to respect the rights of the majority, minority, and the individual. And I don't see that being a problem. The individual also has to respect the rights of the majority, the minority, and the group. And we do have situations where you have that one person, okay? Assume attentions are honorable. Y'all don't make enough money for this to be, for this to be a seat you're holding for anything but the love of your city. So the assumption is that everybody's intentions are honorable, right? And have honorable intentions yourself. I mean, sometimes you're not going to like each other, but that's okay. Treat others as you want to be treated, and respect the position each of you holds. You've been elected by the citizens of Danville, and that's an honor. I know y'all feel that. Yeah, some do. And my clicker quit clicking. Or I forgot to put in my last slide, which was just going to tell you thanks. So not a big deal if I forgot to put my last slide in. I was probably in the middle of it. Yep, that was the last slide. So I forgot to put my name. So Earl knows how to get in touch with me, and I've given you all my information before in various slides and presentations. I usually put it at the end, but apparently I saw something shiny and went off to do something else and forgot to put the last slide in here. So I'm Morgan Patterson, the Director of Municipal Law. Y'all can reach out anytime. City manager, city attorney, Ashley, I hear from them. So, glad to be here, and I appreciate y'all. If you have any questions, I'll stick around for a little bit.
Well, so is it in our book that you have to run every 2 years?
It's in the Constitution.
Okay, and it's not staggered, it's always all together?
It depends on the city, but
Okay.
at a certain point, it was set. So once the
Okay.
elections are held that way, then it goes forward from there.
Okay.
But yeah, the mayor's every 4 years, all commissioners, council members are every 2.
How do you get the staggered?
I don't know, because usually, the usual question I get is changing form of government. I don't know if you can change that.
Takes a vote.
I don't know if you can change.
I think it's constitutional. I
See,
think
and
it take an
that's-
act of the legislature to do that.
To stagger the votes.
But they have
I'm
to
not
initiate
sure.
it, and then there'd be a constitutional amendment vote, I believe.
See, and I'm not sure if that, because some cities are staggered. But I think it was kind of frozen in time, like once you made the decision, and I'm not 100% on that. I would need to check. I don't think you can undo staggering. You can change your form of government, but I don't think you can change to stagger. But I'm gonna double check because I don't know that for sure.
I was wanting you to discuss what is about the good of public part of our agenda. We have 2 opportunities for the public. One is just for items on the agenda. The second one is for anything and everything. We need to figure out a better way to say that, but
Okay, well, that is completely up to the city. There is no requirement that the public even be allowed to speak. Yeah, so the construct is one that y'all put in place. So I don't know, how you've done it.
We did that for administrative efficiency, because we said to the extent there was gonna be business, it's a business meeting. And so instead of being disrupted by the flow of various comments, we would allow quick comments on agenda items that were gonna be discussed and debated and voted on by the commission. And then after that is complete, those items are completed, there's another open session for just, the story of whatever may be on someone's mind. That was just by selection. We don't have to have the first one, we don't have to have the second. We can restrict comments to the agenda. We have had recently, an attempt to use the public comment section to espouse on non-city issues. So, we don't have to go through the exact examples, but it would be akin to someone coming up and speaking about Second Amendment rights, pro-life, pro-choice, foreign affairs, national entanglements, national security matters, all of which have no correlation to city business whatsoever. And to prevent City Hall from becoming a public forum for the discussion of those ideas, we have shut that down and said the proper place for those are in the public square, but not in the city business meeting. So we protect this space for business.
And there's nothing wrong with that. The city can restrict, if you allow public comment, you can restrict it to reasonable time, place, manner restriction. And what that means is, yeah, you can say it's only for public business. You can limit them to, okay, public comment for 30 minutes, and each individual can have 3 minutes to speak.
okay.
Right? I mean, so you can put those reasonable limits as long as it's not, I'm gonna let you talk for as long as you want from my friend. But if you annoy me, I'm gonna cut you off for 3 minutes, right?
Yeah. I've worked with some public agencies that have said, instead of saying 3 minutes per person, they said we are going to allot 30 minutes for public comment, and we will divide that time between the speakers who elect
done a little lyric about how to say the second one, and it's just, that
Yeah.
incident.
I think the first one is easily said,
Yes.
restricted to items that are on our agenda.
Yes.
And I think you could say for the second one is a time to speak on matters concerning city matters that aren't on the agenda.
You get that?
City,
Did you repeat that?
we could write, I mean, we could write you a little something for that.
Yeah.
And so restricted, so we're only gonna discuss things in here that have to deal with things that are within your purview
Yes.
of governance.
And you said it very well, but I guess it was last night, I said, I don't want to say this time. I just felt like, fuck it.
Or maybe that can be written on the agenda, just that wording. That you
Yeah,
just-
that's
You
right,
know,
yeah.
and then the citizen can
They
read
pick it
that
up,
and be
yeah.
like,
That might- yeah.
That's a good
Yeah,
suggestion.
that works, yeah.
Actually, I think we can work on that.
It just prevents, because the night that happened to us, I was okay, just listen, and then say, thank you. The second night they came back, after we'd had a dialogue about it, I really didn't know how to handle it. And then
Well, that one
Ursula-
caught us all off
Yeah, I think so, yeah, you're
guard.
right.
And sometimes the best
Yeah.
thing to do is instead of being rash, just kind of let that air out
Yeah,
and then gather, make your decision, and then address it going forward.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So I think that was okay.
A lot of people, sometimes people do things like that to get a rise, hoping that somebody's gonna shut them down or do whatever. It's easier to let it go.
And even the second time, once it got started, because I had the 3-minute timer going, I was gonna let them get the 3 minutes, the timer goes, okay, thank you for your presentation, and oh, by the way, as a body, we're not allowed to address that international, that national issue. So if it's written on that agenda like that, it just kills us all of it.
I think that's a good suggestion.
Yeah.
We can,
And see, it gets y'all off the hook, because I was waiting, when
Yeah.
y'all have to decide to do that.
and it was suggested I ask you, we were looking at being a city of ethics, and do you know what the exact amount of hours the commissioners would put in and a
So-
timeline?
I hate to say it, we have temporarily suspended our certified city of ethics only because we're getting ready to revamp it.
Okay.
Part of the reason is we discovered, unfortunately, that some cities were members of regional boards of ethics that didn't exist. And so we were certifying cities where there was no opportunity for anybody to file a complaint or, for anybody to have a review of an ethics complaint.
Wow.
Yeah.
Maureen, what's the benefit to the city? Is it just a professional distinction? Are there any cost savings as far as insurance or anything of that nature?
No, one of the things is it modernizes your ethics ordinance, and we do come in and do ethics training and provide best practices. And it does help cities from the perspective of, I got a call yesterday, and today, where a mayor wants to file ethics complaints against council members. The council members, well, the council members are misbehaving. But none of it is an ethics violation. And so,
Education.
and so having an understanding what constitutes an ethics violation, what doesn't. And, I mentioned it earlier, if somebody has a conflict, it's their responsibility. That conflict is personal to them. And they're the ones who need to say, I have a conflict, so therefore I'm not gonna do X, Y, or Z. And nobody else can do that for them, right? But if they do, and they're benefiting from it financially, then the ethics board or ethics investigation can occur. So walking through that whole process can be helpful. We recently named a kind of working group for ethics, because one of the questions that has kept coming up for things like, what do we do about misuse of public information? Like, it may not be a misuse of confidential information to rise to the level of criminal
Yeah. Like, I'll ask our ethics board, I don't know if you do or don't, they used to train like the ethics board every year, just because, hopefully you don't ever have them active.
Yeah.
But for them to be ready if they were to be needed, should they train them every year?
It's always
Before, or-
helpful. I mean, especially on administrative hearing procedures. Because a lot of boards, they may end up being called if there's an ethics complaint or having to conduct an administrative hearing. Well, nobody knows, I mean, unless you've done it, do you know how to conduct an administrative hearing? I mean, your ethics officials, the majority of them are not going to lie. So having just some of that basic information can help.
I mean, not that you want them to be active, but.
Well, I mean, but you want them to be prepared.
Right.
When they're not, they're suspending it.
We've always tried to retain special counsel in the event of an ethics hearing to preserve my ability to guide the commission's response if necessary, or if I've felt it's a conflict as representative of the board of commissioners, if they, as a member, are before the ethics board, I've felt it puts me in legal conflict to preside over a member in which I serve. So I think that's a concurrent conflict. So that's the position we've taken. So we tend to hire special counsel for those particular matters as they arise.
I think that's, I think that's absolutely appropriate.
Is that why you did it?
What's that?
Is that why you did it?
Well, I did what?
Didn't show up? They told me you kicked me to the curb.
No, I would never do that. Well, the other thing, in your matter, I had given you advice from here that your actions were in accordance with the ethics ordinance. Another reason. A lot of times we'll have ethical questions that arise during the meeting. If I'm advising them on those matters, I shouldn't preside at the ethics hearing in which there, someone has brought a complaint.
Oh, yeah,
We just like messing with
We
you.
had to do
Yeah.
trial boards, I had to do trial boards at state police, because when troopers are disciplined to a certain amount or removed, they can appeal to a trial board, which are all troopers. And the person who's chairing is the captain. So we would hire administrative hearing officers to help advise them on motions and the like. Well, I'm in the middle of prosecuting a trooper in a trial board, and their counsel made a motion, I objected, and the captain looks at me, he's like, well, Morgan, what do I do? And I'm like, wait, no, not me, not them. Because they were used to,
Yeah.
me. So that only has a slight appearance of, conflict, so yeah.
What's the number one thing you see as a problem for local governments? In your expertise, having been all the way across this wide commonwealth?
I mean, honestly, the biggest one is the inability to diversify and raise earnings. It's the biggest problem every single city faces, because there's only so much you can do. But if you're talking about,
For the board level, so let's look at it like this, the board level, city commission. What's the hardest thing for them across the board that you see?
we were just talking about this, one of the biggest things that I've seen, which is why I talked about how I emphasize now in this training about speaking with employees in public, is people are just mean to each other. And that's been something that we see increasing in legislative work. And again, Earl has not told me that you guys are mean to each other. And I have no reason to think that you are, but people have just gotten and have become increasingly nasty. And that has been the biggest impediment to cities moving forward that I've seen. And it's just gotten worse. And it's a shame, because there's nothing I can do about it. I mean, I can come in and tell you I'm a law, and, if you ask me, how do cities operate effectively, and what's the most efficient, I can tell you, like it says, make sure that you're respecting each other, and always operate with the idea that everybody has the best interest of the city at heart. Just don't agree on how that looks.
And we can't let that happen to us. I just can't imagine how this community would react if the five of us got to doing that to each other, publicly or privately. traveling